Hi guys, Footy Focus podcast episode 26. We've got a special guest on, Marc McGowan, not the WA Premier, but the AFL journalist. So we'll kick off.
Yeah, so it's great to have Marc on. So thank you for your time. And
no worries, guys.
Yeah, a lot of people would know him. He used to write for AFL.com.au, and he's a respected journalist and the one with a bright future. And he used to follow the Kangaroos pretty closely when he used to work for the AFL. As a Kangaroos fan, I thought his views were pretty on the mark and very professional. And I think he'd already know that Kangaroos fans sort of like his point of view and the work he does. So now we'll talk a bit about the Kangaroos and also get a little bit into that free agency stuff and a bit on Orazio Fantasia as well.
Yeah, so I'm a mad Port supporter, so we'll touch on that a bit later. Yeah, so
no worries, guys.
Yeah, so first question is how you got into the industry and, just you started loving football from an early age or?
Yeah, pretty much. As far as covering AFL footy, I've only covered it for sort of 4 years. Before that, I was sort of all over Australia, really. With journalism, you got to go out of your comfort zone. So I worked in the country. I moved to Darwin for a little bit. So I've been all over. But as far as covering AFL, the last 4 years, I went straight from working in Darwin at the NT News, where I was a sports editor, and then an opportunity came up at the AFL website, and I was fortunate enough to come through the interview process. And as far as what you said there, just always loving footy. I mean, I grew up, had a couple of really close mates who got me into footy, and then from there it was probably a bit of an obsession reading the Herald Sun sports section. Yeah. And then from a pretty young age, I was keen to follow that path, and was sort of fortunate enough to be successful in getting a job. And obviously at the moment, with COVID, unfortunately, I was one of the ones made redundant. But the past 4 years and journalism in total, my career there has been it's been a real privilege, and hopefully it's not the end, but we'll see. It's a pretty tough time for a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, 100%. So, no doubt you'll be fine because I think one of the professional writers. So we might talk about the Kangaroos to kick things off. So at the end of 2016, we Brad Scott and sort of the list management team decided to retire Brett Harvey, Petrie, and all these superstars. But 2 years later, they sort of topped up again with Polak, Pittard. So they didn't bottom out exactly. So do you have a view on that? Do you think I know hindsight's sort of like we have the privilege of that now, but it seems like those 2 or 3 years seems like a waste now because what we're doing now is like a clean out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree with where you're coming from. 2016, I'm sure if there's Kangaroos fans listening, they're well aware of what went on that year. Brent Harvey, Drew Petrie, Michael Ferrito, Nick Del Santo, and even Daniel Wells moved on, going to Collingwood. So that for me seemed a really logical time to fully fledged, let's rebuild this list, let's go again. Brad Scott decided to stick around. They'd obviously had those really successful, 2014, 2015, making the prelims. But they probably topped out at that point. That was probably the best that list was going to get. They were beaten pretty handsomely in prelims. So they seem to be embracing a youth movement at that point. The decisions in 2017 seemed to fit that as well. And then, as you said, 2018, when you look back, it does seem a really strange move when 2 years later we're where we are now, with North Melbourne making such drastic changes to the list, which I completely agree with. 2018, all you can assume, it's obviously a different list management team. We don't have the benefit of them sitting here right now, but you'd have to assume they thought they were in a better spot than they were at that point, because it just doesn't make sense to bring in the Aaron Halls, the Dom Tysons, Jasper Pittards. It made sense bringing in a guy like Polek. I didn't mind that if it was in isolation. They knew they were getting Taran Thomas that year, so they wanted to trade out that first round pick so that they could, they'd be getting Taran anyway because they'd be able to match with him being an academy prospect. So it made sense to use that first round pick to bring in, experience, pace. They needed that. But the problem was it didn't stop with him. They got Pittard in that deal. Again, I wouldn't have minded it if it was just those two. But then to go with Aaron Hall and Dom Tyson, even to a lesser extent, a guy like Tom Campbell, I thought it just didn't make sense with where they were supposedly going in 2016. So I think the word used was waste. I think that's a pretty appropriate word. From everything that happened in 2016, that just had to be a clean-cut move. Let's go in a different direction.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. So definitely. So for me, it just feels like they were maybe just desperate. Cam Joyce and Brad Scott, they thought they were close enough back then. So the decision to trade for Polak and not instead of getting ahead of that Thomas bid, they decided to go back. So I guess, but now I'm more confident in the list management team, and they've got a clear vision, and I think. I think as fans, we should be more optimistic.
Yeah, I think admitting your mistakes, I think, is the number one step. Imagine if they didn't get rid of 11 or 14 players, you're still not admitting your mistakes. So I think that's the first step, and complete rebuild is step one.
Yeah.
It's a funny one when you mention the word admitting your mistakes. I mean, in some ways, it's the mistakes of the previous regime. It's a completely different crew off field. You've got your Mark Finnegan still heading up recruiting, but outside of that, it's so different. A different coach. We know how that all ended up in 2019, and then there's going to be another coach again. It's so far separated from that. Then you've got your Scott Clayton's coming in, Glenn Luff, Brady Rawlings is now heading up the football department. They have a different philosophy. It's not their mistakes. As they've touched on quite a lot this year, they came in pretty late in the stage last year. There were still a lot of contracts for 2020. So there wasn't a lot they could do. They had their hands tied in some ways. So this year was about really analysing the list, seeing what they had, and making some really strong decisions, which is what they did. A lot of those, 11 is a big amount to chop in one hit. And then you see guys like Ben Brown, Sean Higgins getting traded out as well. But a lot of the guys that were delisted, they were injury prone. They were middling talents. They weren't going to take North Melbourne anywhere significant. And on top of that, they came 17th this year. You can't shy away from that. And drastic change needed to be made. And I still think they've got a really nice base of kids there. We'll see how good they are in the coming years, but I think they've got a real building block there to have some future success.
Yeah, and that cutting the list, and that's something you talked about, I think, a few months ago. You were on the North Talk podcast with Ross Payne, I think, and you flagged that plus the mid-teen sort of clean out. And I think what you said, is justified and came to fruition.
Yeah, so I guess what are your expectations of the Roos in the next 2 or 3 years while they embark on this full rebuild?
It's a really interesting one because you just can't. I mean, without a crystal ball, it's difficult to know exactly. My general opinion is I think it's probably going to be a tough couple of years, but with plenty of promise in that period. But then on the flip side, you listen to that members forum the other day, and Glenn Luff, the list manager, sounds quite bullish about what could happen next year. Yeah, he was.
He was really immediately positive. He was like, we'll bounce back. So it seemed like another bottom 3-2 finish might be less likely than we think.
Yeah, I still see them in that tier. But again, you have to have someone in there when you're predicting ladder. But I mean, who's ever got the ladder right year after year? We never do. There's always a surprise. And I still think it's difficult to imagine when you lose so many players and you trade out veterans like your Ben Browns and Sean Higgins. I still think there's going to be a little bit of short-term pain because there is going to be a lot of kids that are going to be playing games. I think Aiden Corr's a really nice addition down back. They've still got your Robbie Tarrants, your Todd Goldsteins. Ben Cunnington will be back. So there is a real core of sort of older guys that you can depend on, but it's just probably not as big a group as what you see at some of the other clubs. So for me, unless they get drastic improvement out of kids, which could happen, I think guys like Luke Davies-Uniacke, I think he'll take another really big step next year. Josh Simpkins already proven that he's at a really good level and can compete with the best on-ballers in the comp. So guys like that, and then you add in a Jaden Stevenson. We already touched on Aiden Corr. There are some nice pieces there, and it just depends on whether the kids can get dragged along, whether we get improvement out of your Cam Zerhas. I wouldn't completely be shocked if they made a bit of a jump, but I think it's unrealistic to think they'll be playing finals footy as soon as next year.
Yeah, as a fan, I'd like to see. I don't want to finish like 10th, 11th, 12th again. If we're going to do this properly, I'd prefer like another bottom four finish and get another elite kid. Maybe do some clever trading and get another future pick in from another team for next year. And yeah, have that strong group of dozen kids coming together. And I thought this year, what let us down was that middle age bracket. I thought our senior players did pretty well, like Goldie and Tarrant. They were pretty good, and the kids were good. But it's the middle, the 20s, 25-year-olds, those that really let us down. So I think, like you said, if the Davies, Geniacs, and Zerhas can play more consistent footy, then we might finish sort of closer to the sixth last instead of like bottom.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we never know which players are going to make a huge jump. I mean, if you look at this year, who would have predicted Luke McDonald to win the BNF? And he put together a fantastic year, made a huge leap in his footy, and you still got a guy like Trent Dumont in that age bracket that you spoke about. He's super consistent. He's always around that top 5 in the best and fairest. So you know what you're going to get from a guy like that. So the difference that we see in every club, when a team climbs up the ladder, as we touched on just before, it depends on if players can all together have a big leap. We've seen that with a club like Port Adelaide. There's lots of clubs like that. It depends on if you can get a group of guys playing career best footy. It just goes a long way to what can happen. And then you get your kids around them. There's not as much that's dependent upon them. My big query is just on the forward line. With Ben Brown coming out, yes, he didn't have a great year, but Nick Larkey is now the number one man up there. That's a big responsibility. He's still really young in his own footy. He's had some injuries over time and hasn't played a heap of footy, and now he's the number one man. I'm a big fan of him. I think he's a really bright talent. But being the number one forward means obviously you're going to get the best defender every week. That's a big responsibility. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do in the draft, whether they get a Logan McDonald, a Riley Thilthorpe. Can those guys come in and have an immediate impact? I think that might be asking a lot. But again, they might depend on your smaller look, like your Jaden Stevensons, your Jack Marnies. Taran Thomas might jump up and be a marking target. So they've got some nice ingredients as a forward line. But whether they can put it all together, that's just a bit of a query for mine.
Yeah, you were bullish on Charlie Comben, but again, he's like a second round draft pick, and his body still might be 12 months, 18 months away. But it's going to be interesting forward line because I don't particularly like Josh Walker playing there. I reckon he's a lot better defender than he's a forward. So, maybe surrounding Larkey with Stevenson and Zeeble as that second and third marking tour might be the way to go.
Yeah, David King said a few times on Fox Footy that, Cam Zerha, he wants him to have a big off-season like a Petrarca. Maybe he can be coming out of the goal square maybe because he's got the body to do that. Give Larkey
it's a big comparison. To Christian Petrarca. I mean, I get the power and the strength and the explosiveness, but we're yet to see that Cam can play extended minutes in the midfield. He has his little fits and spurts. They chuck him in for a change up, but yes, Petrarca has only played probably predominant midfield this year, but even before this, he was still playing quite a lot of time through the midfield as well as forward. Cam Zerha still has a huge way to go if they expect him to become a midfielder forward or a forward midfielder. At this stage, he's purely a forward who can pinch hit in the midfield. And I'm probably not as high on him as a lot of other people because I just haven't seen the consistency in his football. Yes, we've seen the flashes and everyone loves the big hits and the tackles. And yes, he's kicked 5 goals in a game a few times, but for me, if you're going to be known as a really good footballer and have a big reputation, which he has at the moment, I think you have to start producing a bit more consistently. And especially as we talked on, if North Melbourne want to take a leap and be outside of that bottom 4, he's the type of guy. He's had a few years under his belt now. He needs to take a big leap. And whether that's just as a forward, that's fine. But they just need to get more consistent contribution from him.
Yeah, it's well said because I think the average person watching just thinks high and the media hype and they
he's elite, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So that's well said, Mark. Just in terms of on-field leadership, like we delisted Pittard and got rid of Higgins. Who else? Macmillan left. Do you reckon the leadership is a bit thin now with too much reliance on Tarrant Siebel? Who's going to step up, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think when there is a bit of a void, you immediately think, oh, wow, there's going to be a lack of leadership. But it also provides opportunity for others. We saw a guy like Jai Simpkin have a bit more responsibility this year. And yes, he's still young, but I think he's really valued internally. So I immediately see him as someone who might step up in that regard. And outside of that, it's really, really interesting. When there's opportunity, you need some others to step up. It could be a Trent Dumont. He might be the one who might have a bit of a louder voice, with more opportunity. But Robbie Tarrant's never been a vocal leader. He's a guy who sort of leads by example, gets around quietly around the club. Jack Ziebel is very much still the best captain choice at this stage. You'd imagine a guy like we touched on Jai Simpkin earlier. It's probably a little bit early for him now, but if they can get another couple of years out of Ziebel, I think a guy like Simpkin would be a really good choice to take over. And you'd hope within 2 years' time he's really considered as an A-grade on-baller. That's what they'd really hope. And Cunnington as well. I mean, look, he comes in. He's not the most vocal guy either, but with the experience going out, he's probably just going to have to step up a little bit in that regard. But on field, I mean, he already does that. So I don't think there's a vacuum there. Like there's a lack of leadership. I genuinely think there's still some veterans there that can help out in that regard. And I do see some kids that have got some leadership qualities, even Luke McDonald as well.
Yeah, 100% with Simpkin there. I think he missed the under 22 this year.
It's
and
a bit of an oversight.
And he got like 9 Brownlow votes. So I guess it's just what happens when you're a Kangaroo midfielder or a player.
It's a tough team to break into, especially in the midfield.
Yeah, I think I was impressed by Curtis Taylor. Like early on when we needed a goal and someone to step up, he was like presenting and he was doing the things you'd ask of a leader. So he could be a young leader. I don't know about his leadership skills, but yeah, one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Curtis as a player. As a leader, I'm not too sure because he is still a kid. It was basically his first season playing regular AFL footy this year. But as a talent, he's really gifted and he's just what they need as well as a really nice kick going inside 50 because that was something they probably lacked. Playing that high half forward role, I really am quite bullish on what he becomes. But again, you probably get a better indication in their second, third years playing because opponents start to figure them out a bit more. So if he is able to keep moving forward, I think we'll know North Melbourne's got a good one.
Yeah, so we'll put a poor question in there just for some.
That's good discussion with the Kangaroos. So I think we've got a few Kangaroo listeners, so they'll enjoy that.
Yeah.
So we might jump onto the Port Adelaide.
Yeah, so I guess the Horatio Fantasia article you had on the afl.com.au website, I know it's 12 months down the track, but I guess how do you feel and what kind of hate did you cop from Essendon supporters? Because I think Sam Edmonds copped it this year when he's tweeted out about the Treloar and Bucks conversation. He's proved right in the end, similar to you. So how did you take it? Was that kind of your first experience of, I don't know, trolling or kind of hate from the supporters?
That's probably the biggest one. I think as a journo, when you're on social media, you always cop a little bit of that. I'm fortunate I don't cop a great deal, but that was a really big one. It was a really funny experience because, I did my due diligence. It's not the sort of story you toss out there without, without doing the work behind the scenes before you publish it. And I was very, very, very confident in what I went with, and I'd spoken to a lot of people, and that's why I went with it. I wouldn't have otherwise. And when it first came out, the instant reaction was the Essendon fans were sort of like, well, good riddance to him. See you later, on your bike sort of thing. And then once a story like that comes out, we're in a culture in the media where, everyone else wants to jump into it as well. So what they instantly did was they jumped on the phone to his agent, and we're talking about a mid-season story. So at that stage, they didn't want to confirm that anything was even on the card. So it became a denial story in the Herald Sun. That was the first article that sort of shut it down a bit. And then instantly, once that came in, the whole narrative changed. So as soon as the agent had said, "No, he's not leaving," all the backlash began. And then after that, there was what's called a doorstop, where Orazio Fantasia was actually at the Essendon Footy Club, and a couple of journos went out there in reaction to my story, and they were given 2 questions. The first question was, are you leaving, or are you leaving this year? And Orazio's comment was that he basically dismissing it and he laughed at the story, and then the second question was, were you angry about the story? So it wasn't a great setup from the 2 journos there. And then again, that just added to the backlash. I was getting messages privately, online, publicly, either way. There were people telling me I should lose my job, telling me to hope you're keeping the lights on tonight. It was a ridiculous experience. I think I had Nick Revolt giving me a clip on the radio the next day. It was a pretty extraordinary 24 hours, and I'm probably never going to forget it as far as a career experience. And it certainly wasn't a positive one at the time, but I think I was asked as well in an interview later on, whether it took courage to do the story. And I mean, they always do a little bit when you're putting something like that out. But in reality, I'd done the work. I'd spoken to the right people. I'd spoken to plenty of people on it, like I always do. I don't put anything out off one source, and I was confident in what I was reporting. And so, look, it obviously came to fruition. I had to wait a little bit longer for my justification than what probably Sam Edmund did. But, look, I mean, I certainly didn't get the apologies at the same volume as the hate. But, look, that's fine. I'm not in it to get backslaps either. But I just think people on social media probably need to understand a little bit that we're not on there making things up. No one makes things up. And I guess there's a lot of hate around unnamed sources and all these sorts of things, but that's how this information comes out. I wasn't going to get that story that would never have been reported if it was relying on someone putting their name to it that told me. That was never going to happen. And we wouldn't find out, 3/4 of the news that gets put out there if there was always a source to it. So, yes, I understand we have to be accountable, but I also think there needs to be a balance between not jumping the gun and just believing everything a player says or a club says, because they lie often. And what we do, look, I knew I'd done the work, so there wasn't a lot I could say because I can't respond to people and say, hang on, I've spoken to this person, this person, this person. You can't do that because you've got your sources and they have trust in you that you won't out them and say who they are. But look, there was definitely a bit of gratification when it all came through. And even last year when it started getting traction that he might be moving. And I think by then everyone started believing that there was something in what I'd been reporting. But he obviously didn't move until this year. But look, ultimately, as I said, I'm not doing it for the back slaps. But I think it was probably a good experience for fans to hopefully learn. But I highly doubt they will.
Yeah, hopefully they remember like that, because a lot of people will probably forget who wrote this story
last year.
Yeah, so it's not good work.
Oh, it was definitely a pretty rough 24 hours. Like I'm not going to say it didn't get to me, even though I knew I'd done the work. It was pretty vicious. There's a lot of feedback. Let's put it that way. But yeah, look, you got to be a big boy and you got to have thick skin in this industry.
Main thing is you're right in the end anyway.
Yeah. We might talk a little bit about the free agency system, because I know you've got a view on this, specifically just with compensation. When a team loses a free agent, like for example, Danaher left for Brisbane and Essendon got compensated with pick 7, do you think that system should be tweaked or changed? Because I guess Brad Crouch Adelaide missing out on pick 2 was the main one this year, but it could come again next year. I think they've got Matt Crouch, Rory Laird, and Brodie Smith out of contract, and they're all free agents. So there might be, and then they'll probably finish at the bottom again. And there's a few South Australian kids next year, so this story might pop up again. So I'd just like to know your views on the compo.
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of free agency compensation. I've sometimes thought that we should just scrap it, but I looked into it for an article I wrote recently, and I probably looked a little bit closer at what they're doing in probably the NFL in particular, and they do have a compensation system. It's just a little bit different, and I genuinely think it's superior to what the AFL's doing. My issue is with, especially in the first round, if you're giving compensation for the first round, not only, yes, that's giving compensation to the club that's lost a player, but what it also does is it detrimentally impacts on the clubs around them. So a club that finishes towards the bottom, could be pushed back several picks because a free agent leaves a club that finished below them. And I understand that the AFL is trying to establish that equality system where, if a player leaves a team that finishes, first or second, it makes a grand final, they don't get as big compensation as what a team that finishes towards the bottom. It seems logical in that way. But what doesn't factor in is, as I said before, how it impacts on other clubs who are desperate to get a really nice early player in. Someone from the draft class who's one of the most promising players in the system that year. And that's what this year has done. It's not. There's been a couple of those ones. Is that Jeremy Cameron? Yes, ended up being matched, and he wasn't there, but he could have made it even more complicated. Zach Williams is already in there as a free agent who's getting compensation, and you touched on Brad Crouch as well, Joe Danaher. Yes, Brad Crouch ended up slipping to the second round, but if he'd got the number 2 pick for the Crows, one, that's too much for him to start with. And yes, I understand that it's based on what salary they get from the club they're going to, but in no trade scenario is Brad Crouch ever getting pick 2. And that's the issue I have with this and the way it operates. I think what we see in the NFL is a different system where, as it gets later on, a player comes out and you don't get a pick inside that first round. It can be from sort of round 3 onwards. And that's a more valuable pick than a round 3 in the AFL because they have so many players on the field. But round 3 is obviously outside of the first round, which doesn't impact on those top tier prospects that are coming in. And even baseball's got a system where the Major League Baseball over there, where if there is a first round pick that goes out, it often comes from the club that is getting the player. So the compensation comes from the player who receives them. So it's almost like a trade. So there's a couple of different tweaks that could be introduced into the AFL system that I think would work really well. But my main thing is trying to clear first round compensation picks. I think if they can get rid of that and find a different way of doing that, I think that'd be a really positive step. And part of that might mean we have to push draft contracts, those initial ones out from 2 years to 3 or 4 years, maybe if it only is for the first round. But there's a couple of tweaks I think would be really beneficial. And you'd hope that the guys responsible for it at the AFL are monitoring this and are open to change because it is a pretty flawed system at the moment.
Yeah, I'd say they should be because they've already started changing the NGA rules. So now they're trying to make the first 20 picks and I think the next year after the first 2 rounds, less compromise. So I think that's a step in the right direction. With the Sydney and the Northern Academies, not too bad there. I reckon they're in a rugby dominant area, so I don't mind them getting a little bit of a leg up. But yeah, to get the first round uncompromised as much as possible. Just because when I think back to when Hawthorn got those priority picks, how they got Ruffhead and Ellis and these guys, and even Collingwood, they essentially got Pendlebury. I know Dale Thomas was a priority pick, but Pendlebury would have been not a Pies player. And those were teams that finished with 4 or less wins back then. They got an extra pick, whereas now when Kangaroos and we finished like bottom, we win 3 games of the year, but then our first pick could have been pushed back to like 4, like with the Jamara bid as well, if Brad Crouch got that. So I feel a little bit ripped off there, but so as soon as the first round gets uncompromised would be a good starting point to help teams like us like to push into finals and contend for a premiership rather than having dynasties every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think the stats tell us that after it gets beyond the first round, even the first 20 or so picks, it's a bit of a lottery. I know everyone thinks a second round pick or a pick in the 20s is still really high, but the hit rate, the miss rate at that point starts to spike by that period. So those early picks are so important. They just don't. They used to get them. It'd be a bit hit or miss in the early days of the draft, but these days, in those top 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 picks, I mean, the strike rate is really impressive. They do so much work now, whether it's psychological, physical, speaking to friends, speaking to family. They tick all the boxes these days. They rarely get them wrong. Yes, they don't all become stars, but generally, if you're picked in the top 10, you become a pretty good player, and you'll often play 150, 200 games. And if you get that out of a player, you're pretty happy, I think. Obviously, you'd love to become dual All-Australians and premiership players and Coleman medalists and all these sorts of things. But if you can get a player that you can slot into your 22 who becomes a really good player and a long-term player for 8, 10, 12 years, I think you've got a good one. And if you get those early picks, you've got a greater chance. And the numbers tell us that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, you'd responded to a tweet last week about, I guess free agents walking to the preseason draft for free. We've seen it with Jack Martin last year and obviously Jackson Hately. You reckon there's any kind of solution for that, or?
I just think that the preseason draft needs to go. I don't see the point of it. It just leaves a loophole that allows players to just, not only players, but the club that the player is going to hold it over the club that the player is leaving from. And what motivation, say in the Jackson Hately case, what motivation did Adelaide have to try to offer them a better deal when they knew they could get him for free in the preseason draft? The thing is, it doesn't completely rule things out. If you get rid of the preseason draft and let's say that deal still doesn't get struck, they can still draft him in the national draft. But it's obviously a lot easier to get him in the preseason draft because, the national draft, you might last until 30 or 40, however long you last, but there's a lot more chance for other clubs to swoop. So it just adds to the risk and it makes it tougher for them to take that risk. We saw a guy like Luke Ball, going back a fair way now. He put a price on his head and I think he refused to do a medical for any other club. And I think Collingwood ended up swooping on him somewhere in the 30s after he left St Kilda. So it does happen. There's precedent for it. The other option is to get the AFL involved in a mediation process. I'm even open to it being post-draft, but I think you'd probably post-trade period, I should say. But ideally, you'd like to get it within that deadline. But if it does hit a stalemate and it's clearly not going to get done, rather than a player just being able to walk out for free, I'd like to see a mediation process take place. It's an interesting one because you saw Jack Martin last year and Gold Coast was saying, look, second and third round picks mean nothing to us. We need top line kids coming in. We wanted a first round pick. It's not multiple second rounders. We want one first round pick. And they were really steadfast on that. So, I mean, you can't demand that. And the AFL and the mediation system couldn't just say, all right, give them their first round pick. It's not as simple as that. But I just think it would make the process fairer and would exhaust the options of avoiding a player just walking for free. Because Jackson Hately was a first round pick 2 years ago. And now he leaves and away you go. And yes, GWS have got a lot of midfielders and they've got a lot of talent, but no matter what, they've invested 2 years into a first round pick and they're getting nothing in return.
Yeah, I think it's something the AFL needs to look at, especially when you've got you can pick up players as a delisted free agent or the SSP. There's a lot of ways now. You don't need I think the preseason draft's a bit of an outdated system. Do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I guess in terms of what's on the horizon next for you and your new gig at Inkley, you want to give that a quick plug?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a new gig. It's sort of an opportunity for freelance journos to still be writing and still earning an income. It's sort of an interesting model where articles you write for them. I've signed just a 3-month contract with them at the moment, where I get paid a certain number for subscribers I bring in to Inkle. And also is paid on page views, those sorts of things. So I get a certain amount for how many subscribers I bring in and then how many people read, unique readers I have for my stories. So you're not going to get rich off it, but it's a way for me to earn a regular income while you're searching for another job. Look, it's going to be really hard for me to get back in at the moment. It is really hard. I've certainly had lots of discussions, but I think everyone knows it's not a good time to not be working at the moment in the media. So, yeah, I'm hopeful that something will come up, but at the same time, I have to be realistic. So I'm pretty proud of what I've achieved to date, but I'm also realistic enough to know that it may be the end, which is sad to admit. But without knowing what's to come, I have to be realistic about it. So we'll see what happens.
I think there's a lot of people that would have a long career and wouldn't get as far as you did with the AFL.
Yeah.
So.
All right, yeah. Well, I think you're going to ask the basketball question.
Yeah, I'll just touch on quickly. I know you're a big fan of the Bucks. You happy today? I know they picked up Drew Holiday and Bogdanovic.
Yeah, I'm very, very happy. I wasn't sure we were going to be bringing this up, but yeah, I'm very happy with what the Bucks did today. Yes, there's a bit of talk around the fact that they gave up 3 future first-round picks, so I guess mortgaged their future in some ways. But I think, as we all know, if anyone that follows the NBA, Giannis, if he didn't see the Bucks trying to do something, he'd be gone. This would be his last season and be out of the Bucks, and that'd be just a crippling blow to the Bucks. And they're obviously they're from a small market. They don't get talents like Giannis. They got him at pick 15. It was a bit of a diamond in the rough. They took a punt and he became a superstar. But as far as signing a big name free agent, like a LeBron James or a James Harden, those guys don't sign with the Bucks. So they need to be developed. And even taking a punt on a pick in the 15, pick 15, I think it was, for Giannis, a guy from Greece who was skinny and lanky, and they would have had no understanding that this kid could become what he has, a dual MVP. So I'm stoked that they're all in. They're having a crack. Yes, there's a chance that it all falls apart. Giannis might still leave, and Drew Holiday might opt out, and he might disappear as well. They might not have future first-round picks, but there'd be no regrets because they had a crack. And it doesn't mean they're going to win the title either. But I just like it that they haven't played it safe. I think playing it safe would have been the worst option. So it's going to be an interesting season. We'll see what happens. No,
all right, cool.
Thanks, Mark. We'll let you get to it.
All right, thank you.
No worries, guys. Good on you. All the best.
Yeah, bye.
Cheers.